Thank you so much for joining me on today's installment of the Fraud Fighter series. I'm your host, Christopher Knight, and we'll be throughout your learning journey in the series. Don't forget that this installment is one of many in the series, so please be on the lookout for other installments that will cover topics ranging from admission seeking interviews, organized retail crime, fraud program essentials, case studies on financial crimes, compliance in the seven elements, and so much more. To give a little information about myself, I've been in the fraud and financial crime sector for nearly 20 years. I hold 5 professional certifications that are specific to financial crimes, which are Certified Fraud Examiner, Certified Anti-Money Laundering Specialist, Certified Financial Crimes Investigator, Certified Human Trafficking Investigator, and Certified Counterintelligence Threat Analyst. I've worked in multiple different industries in my career, from law enforcement as a law enforcement officer, to financial services and banking, to tech and gaming, all the way to insurtech. I've worked with both seasoned and startup companies, and as innovation and forward thinking are two of my biggest skill sets, I've had the privilege of building 2 fraud programs from the ground up. One was with a Fortune 100 company, and the other was at a venture capital backed startup. I started my own company in 2023 called Night Vision Fraud Investigation, which is a full suite financial crimes consultancy helping individuals and organizations uncover fraud where others can't. Now, if you want to learn more about myself, background, or curriculum vitae, or would like to contact me or my business, please check out our website by going to www.kvfinvestigations.com. Now let's start today's topic. Okay, today we're going to start talking about fraud program essentials. Basically, what we're going to be doing today is talking about building out a fraud program, kind of what our ideas are, kind of as the minimums you'll need to build out a strong fraud program that's built for success. I am joined today with one of my best buddies, Lacey. She can run circles around me in most anything fraud, with a specialty in e-commerce fraud. We're old co-workers. I love her to death. She's going to bring a lot to this discussion. So I'd love to introduce you to Lacey Ramsey. Lacey, welcome.
Hey, thank you. Thanks so much, Chris. And I hope for everybody listening or viewing this that this is as much fun for you as it is for me, because I love any chance I get to talk about fraud, and especially with Chris. So as you mentioned, I'm Lacey Ramsey. I've done a lot of fraud investigations in my background. I'm one of those like homegrown people who started out, I went to school for criminology, so I have my master's there. And then I started out on the front lines. I was an investigator. I did that in financial services for a few years and moved up through consulting. And now I work at a large e-commerce company where I run our risk mining and prevention programs, as well as dispute resolution or chargebacks, as some of you may know it. So I've got about 15 years of experience total in criminal and financial investigations. I've also done a lot of policy administration and creation. And throughout all of this, the focus has been on project or program management. Currently, for my team, I have teams that are located in India, Costa Rica, Japan, the UK, as well as the US. And this is, so it's pretty big now. My group.
That's a lot of time zones.
It is. I mean, I never sleep. No, I'm just kidding. I have a great team of about 150, and that's inclusive of risk specialists or investigators, as well as the operations managers and the program managers that lead the strategy for that group. And throughout the course, I didn't just get here by magic. I wasn't just teleported to this position. I've done a lot leading up to this, but as part of the company that I'm at, I've been able to implement 2 global AI tools. And one of those was for internal investigations, the other one for external, but essentially, like, we're looking at fraud or abuse. It's kind of been fun to see it from both sides. And I know, Chris, you've had the background working with me on that internal tool that we deployed.
Yeah.
And man, there's just so much to think about as you're putting on the different hats when you're looking at bad actors from inside your company as well as outside your company and thinking about all those risk factors.
Mhm.
That list just gets really, really long. Yeah, so that was so challenging, just being able to deploy those tools and make it scalable. We're going to talk a lot about scalability today and how to make sure you've got a sustainable program that's ready for what you're trying to handle or detect today, as well as what's coming tomorrow.
Yeah, that was an interesting project. It was tough because you're trying to balance, unneeded friction for the customer with, okay, well, we got to stop fraud too. So you're right. There's a lot of different hats, but I loved it. You killed it. You knocked that one out of the park. I'll give you that. It's still implemented there from what I know of and doing great. So
It is. It is still there. It's still here. It's something we've kept going. We'll get a chance today to talk about like vendor management a little bit, about what it's like to work with a third party company when you
mhm.
need to deploy some technology in your company. I've been on both sides of it. I've been in one where you paid for services and another one where you built those services yourself. So there's a lot to consider.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I figured we could start off with kind of giving some, I would say, important statistics, I guess. I think these really hone in on why a solid fraud program, the basic foundations are really important. So 5% of revenue is lost per organization to fraud each year. You think about 5%, that's a huge number, no matter how you look at a company. Large companies, 5%, that could be millions and millions and millions of dollars. And small companies, it may not be millions of dollars, but to them, it's a big chunk of their gross revenue. So 5% loss to fraud each year is significant. So having a strong fraud program is obviously essential to that. Median losses of 117,000 with an average loss of 1.8 million per case. That's a lot of money. I think that one pretty much speaks to itself. I can tell you I wouldn't want to lose either of those numbers. The most interesting one, and I think really hones in on the fact of why a fraud program is essential, especially kind of in startups, because you're usually building a fraud program because there isn't one there. So organizations with the fewest employees had the highest median losses. So that's why having a solid program and getting it started and up and running fast is really key, but it also has to be done right too. So you have to balance those two. And nearly half of cases occurred due to lack of controls or overriding controls, which basically tells you that the fraud program isn't doing what it should. And that's why I think this is going to be great for the people that are thinking about starting a fraud program, or even some of this stuff that we're going to talk about today. I think will harp on what you can do to revamp your fraud program, maybe reorganize it, make it a little better. Hopefully that's what comes out of this. But I don't know, Lacey, any of these sticking out to you at all, or based on your extensive e-commerce experience specifically, because I think that's where a lot of places are going. We're not seeing a ton of retail as much as we used to e-commerce, but do these sound low? Do they sound high? Do they sound pretty spot on? What do you think?
Yeah, I think for the company that I work for, of course, thinking about the numbers, like fraud is increasing year over year. There's no way around it. And it's not necessarily because the proportion of fraud to, bad actors to good actors is changing. It's just the fact that despite what you might be hearing based on, or experiencing yourselves based on inflation and whatnot, the actual online shopping continues to grow. So
Mhm.
that just gives every time we have even more shopping that occurs, that's even more opportunities for these fraudsters to get their hands on somebody's account, to actually try out new things and hide. I think most importantly, hide in sort of the background and the shadows of what's going on because there's just so much extra volume of activity that's happening online. So from my perspective, yeah, even from this, looking at this, the percentage of revenue to fraud each year, at 5%, no matter where you cut it and what company you're talking about, it's a big number.
It's a
So
big
it's
number.
something to take into consideration for sure.
Yeah, and I did mean to mention. So I gathered most of these from the 2022 ACFE report to the nation. So we're still a few months after that was reported, and these numbers were probably gathered even before that. So I wouldn't be surprised if things have increased. Just the what we're seeing nowadays in trends, fraud is definitely going up. So I wouldn't be surprised if this is just the start of it.
Yeah, and I need to go back and review that report again for myself, but I don't even know if these numbers account for crossover fraud, instances where there's multiple different types of fraud layered together. Like when we look at median
Yeah.
loss, 117K, I don't know if that's just like per pop or if that's like, if there's combinations of fraud that could be happening that aren't getting accounted there. So
Good
yeah,
point.
it's
Be good to look
complex.
at. That's our next podcast. There you go. We'll start diving into statistics. So for moving on, I think at least for me, you probably agree, Lacey. I think there are two really key areas to build a successful fraud program, in not only development, but actually functionally. Those two are pretty much, for me at least, strategic, which is forward thinking, scalable, innovative, and kind of solves for long-term problems. And then on the flip side of that, we would have operational decision making implementations, and that's kind of really how I would think of how you make the gears turn and work. Anything to add on that, you think, or that pretty much I think key to success there? I mean, everyone has different opinions. Would you add anything to that, you think, or?
No, I wouldn't add. I think at a macro level, this captures it. There are certainly little bitty gears that turn in
Mm,
between inside each one of these, which we're going to get to a little bit of that today. But it's not to say that the operational aspect of something isn't also strategic. There are certainly pieces of
true.
your operations that have to have that strategy, or else it wouldn't work, right? It wouldn't move in sync
Absolutely.
with the strategic view anyway. So yeah, that's the only thing I would say, but we're gonna flesh that out just a little bit more today.
That we will. All right. So let's move on to strategic. So I kind of had this bucketed in three different areas. So tech implementation, mainly thinking third party outside kind of tech implementation. Then moving to alerts, controls, continuous monitoring, and then kind of case management systems. So to start, let's do tech implementation. Um, like I said, for me, tech implementation was thinking more kind of a third party implementation. And the reason I think that's a benefit is because it's typically cutting edge technology. They're using kind of state of the art program software, usually proprietary information that is going to be really, really difficult to build internally uh, with dedicated resources. I'm sure it can be built internally, but having dedicated resources, engineers and product owners and stuff to build something like that is really difficult. So you kind of end up in that risk reward type situation. Another key point to, I think, third party tech implementation is it's really scalable for the future. Typically, it sits on top of whatever system you may be using. So therefore, as your company grows, you can move around where that sits. You can keep it in place and it continues to grow with the company. So there's not really too much work that has to be done to kind of keep it up to par. And by, in contrast too, it enables you to continue to think towards the future and not worrying about too much of kind of the micro trends that are going on, because that company will be doing that on your behalf. So kind of one way to pull out some of your resources to work on other things. I love the fact that it can be used for both fraud prevention and detection methods. The one thing you really do have to think about as a company is there are costs associated with it. There's definitely going to be upfront costs. Typically, you're looking at kind of implementation fees, which some companies it can be a couple thousand. Other companies, you're looking at hundreds of $1,000s for implementation. But I think the key point in this one is you're saving in the long term because it's going to be functioning for you with little resources needed for you to kind of upkeep. But of course, there you have the ongoing fees you're going to have to worry about. Typically tiered pricing or something like that. But what do you have for thoughts kind of on this one, Lacey? Like, what's your thinking on internally built versus third-party technology? What experiences kind of do you have with that? I know you and I worked on a few different ones, and I'm very much in a hybrid model mentality, but I think third-party tech to me is really important.
It is, and I think it's because sometimes as you have a lot of people on the same team who have been working on a large scale project, you're trying to implement something yourself. Sometimes you'll have those blind spots that maybe you don't quite see for yourself. And so that's where a lot of times, even just benchmarking something let's say that you decide you're going to build it yourself, like as a company.
Mhm.
And maybe you have the resources, maybe you have engineering and tech and product and all these people together to work on it. Uh, but even as you build it, it's really important to remain open to whatever feedback or what you're seeing in the industry at large or other products that are out there so that you're not missing really important pieces that you need to include or functionality that you would need. And I think that's super important. So you really have to do this sort of buy versus build review for
Mm.
yourself. If you're the person making the decisions or if you're providing feedback to that person in your company, I can speak to my experience. I can talk about some of the factors that we've had to consider, especially as it comes down to what you're trying to do, defining what that problem statement is. You don't want to go back out. Let me just be clear. Any protection is better than no protection. So you have to always
Yes.
think that default level, like what's the minimum amount of protection I can have? But when you start getting into your must-haves and your nice-to-haves, that's where you start thinking about like maybe the third party option. There could be some technology out there that has all these fancy bells and whistles. You really got to ask yourself, how much of it do I really need? Like, what exactly do I care for? And then as you think about building things, I think Chris was starting to get to this idea about the hybrid model, which is like, is there something that you could buy that's maybe your baseline starting point? It's a product
Mhm.
you can use that overlaps and lays on top of what you've already got in place, works really nicely that you can then layer on top of with your own features, your own products. Those are things that you would want to try to build around if you have the resources to do it. If you don't, of course, then you're going to be looking for the most, the nicest blanket product technology that you can implement that's going to check the most boxes for you. That most importantly is going to give you the best return on investment. And I think from that, you're going to have to decide for yourself, like what kind of false positive rate what's my appetite for false positives? What kind of customer experience, if any, that I'm trying to preserve here? You have to consider like what that downstream impact might be. If you do have those false positives and you lose customers, is that going to then play back into your ROI? Are you losing money at that point, not becoming more profitable? There are a whole lot of different things you got to think about from a data perspective and the cost that you would put into buying a product from another company. But also just like as you're shopping around, typically there's going to be some sandbox moment where you can like kind of play with the product yourself or see what it looks like while it's in development. You can also ask for, I don't think people do this enough, but asking for references, like what other companies
Yeah,
have used this?
absolutely.
Yeah, and you have the right to ask for that. And if they refuse or can't give you those references of other people who are willing to speak on behalf of their product, then you might want to just walk out the door.
Yeah, yeah, that should be a big red flag for you.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so in the hybrid model, I'm also in the same boat as Chris on this one. I think that it's a beautiful marriage of both worlds, which is that you're getting something that a base product somebody else has built that is tested and should work and will be customized to a degree to what you need, while giving you the flexibility to sort of self-fund on those extra features that might be on your nice to have list, things that you would want to add to it. So I highly recommend if you have the capacity to do that in your company to check out being able to do a hybrid approach.
Yeah,
But
as we were thinking, as we were talking about this, I all of a sudden started to think about something. Um, I was going into, okay, when we were talking about build versus buy, and I was thinking, okay, well, if you build internally, there's a big learning curve there. You're going to have to figure out what works. You're going to have to test a lot of things to make sure that it's working internally. But I then started to go down this path in my mind of, well, depending on the company, if you build a good enough solution, you might be able to monetize it. You might be able to actually go and patent it, trademark it and sell it yourself. So, it might be something of interest to start thinking about, which I didn't think about until you literally were speaking about build versus buy. And I was like, you know what, maybe selling
yeah,
it.
you can absolutely sell it. And here's the fun part. When you get to like a really big company, sometimes you can sell it to other organizations within your company.
Absolutely, which will help pay for headcount, upkeep. So you're almost paying for your own investment that you wanted.
Yep. But Chris, I'm going to tell you one more thing that is probably going to blow your mind. And it's actually something that I'm doing right now with my team, which is that so in our organization, we have predictive fraud machine learning model, which of course is trying to help us
Wow,
detect as it's happening. Obviously, we have
impressive.
those models. We actually just built a new process using that same logic of how do we, how do we detect fraud, to also how do we detect or predict when attrition is going to happen on the team. So as we have,
Interesting.
yeah. So that's the other thing I would say is like think outside the box. It may not be fully fraud related, but there could be something that you build yourself that would have multiple uses. And it could go all the way down to just the logic and the like modeling or the coding that you're using for fraud prevention could be used for other sources as well.
Yeah, I don't think we're there yet where we can just put something in Chat GBT and let that figure it out for us. Not there yet, I don't think.
I don't think so. Yeah.
No, that was awesome. All right, let's move on to alerts, controls, and continuous monitoring. So I think one great statistic that I see come up a lot is that 85% of fraudsters display behavioral red flags. 85%. That's a huge number. So basically, everyone that commits fraud almost is displaying some sort of behavior that should cue you in to at least look at them and see what the activity is. If not, just outright be like, yeah, you're a fraudster. We already know that before you even go any further, kind of thing. And I think that's really where your kind of internally built systems are going to be vital, especially because I think your internal systems are much more geared towards your business model. So it's going to be easily adaptable if you all of a sudden decide one day, or your company rather decides one day, we're going to open up a barber shop and you're a retail online retail store. So you can easily adapt to changing needs of the business kind of right up front. And then controls, continuous monitoring, again, all internal in my mind there. But I think your controls are literally just your rules set in place that are going to be hard stops. You know, if you know there's a certain fraud scheme that's happening, or you know that there's certain behavior you don't allow, my dog is apparently don't want to allow, you can hard stop things in there. And I think a lot of companies are afraid to do that because they worry about you know customer conversion and whatnot. But I think you also have to keep in mind the risk you open up by not doing some of these things. And then on the flip side of that, the continuous monitoring would be just that, doing regular audits, reviews, doing data mining, data pulls. I think a lot of companies do a pretty good job at this in their fraud departments where, they're proactively just taking big scoops of data and trying to find, abnormalities or finding patterns that they can identify as new fraud trends to do it. But the beautiful part about all of this is, it's fraud prevention and detection, easily adaptable. And I think one interesting point that I wanted to make was, it's also proprietary. If you build something internal, you don't have to share your secret sauce with anyone. You don't have to explain how it works to anyone. You don't have to give data to, a third party to help you build something. You really get to keep it in-house and as closed as you want it. That way, people can't try and actively find ways to get around those controls that you're making. They're going to try anyways. There's that 10-80-10 rule for internal fraud where, 10% of your employee population, no matter what, would never commit fraud. 80%, given the right opportunity, will absolutely commit fraud. And then the other 10% are actively looking at this moment on ways to defraud the company. So, I think the same holds true for external actors too. It's probably actually more so in that 95% are actively trying to find ways to defraud you. But talking about alerts, controls, and continuous monitoring, I know you have built a lot of different things and you actively do this in your role now. So would love to hear, what else you have to kind of add on to this being a vital piece to, a fraud program.
Yeah, I do want to highlight, you did say something about our systems are built to give us those red flags to show us when those happen. But I mean, I can't see who all is watching this, but raise of hands if you've ever worked for an organization that passed on those red flags to you, but then didn't want you to do anything about them. I think every single one is going to raise their hand on that one. And it's almost like it's a one red flag. Okay, we're good before we can take any action. Thing that we don't talk enough about though is when we see things that are amber flags. These things aren't fully red flags yet, but as you're seeing that like continuous monitoring is showing you that there's this like activity which is like skirting the line between outright egregious or bad activity. It's just right there on the cusp. I mean, let's just say people who are bad actors are reading your policies. They know your company policy better than you do. They know exactly what they can get away with without crossing that line. And for them, if it means they're getting pennies every single time they do this, those pennies are adding up. And for them, they're making a lot of money over time because you didn't catch it or you didn't stop it in the beginning. So it's really important to, I think in a lot of industries, like we would call this abusive behavior, not outright
Mm.
fraudulent behavior, but just abusive behavior, is being able to map that activity over time. And then you have to set your own definition and criteria for when all of those amber flags would turn into a red flag. Like when do we warn this person? Do we want to let them know that we're onto them and stop that activity? Or do we want to continue and keep watching it until it actually turns into a problem and then enforce them? That, these are decisions you have to make for yourself, for your company, but those are things you should be aware of because it's really important for mapping the entire fraud life cycle. It's really important for you understanding what these people are after, what they're trying to do, and then of course for bolstering or improving your own policies. And then the other part of it is kind of going back to that: how many red flags do you have to see before you can take action, similar to how many amber flags do you have to see before you decide there's a red flag. These are decisions you have to take for yourself.
Yeah, it definitely does come down to kind of the risk appetite of the company. I think you and I would, if we could, just shut down all the areas that fraud could happen, but then we'd probably be out of jobs because pretty much anywhere fraud could happen. But it's tough building out for a fraud program, and it's tough even being in a fraud program, especially kind of within this type of space where you really have to explain to leadership, stakeholders, uh, why you want to take actions on certain things. Give them, number one, the fiscal losses that you could have, but also start hopping on, the PR aspects of fraud, how that can affect company and reputational risk and what have you. So there are a lot of different things we have to think about. So I kind of wanted to dive a little deeper into specific alerts. Um, do you have any good recommendations on like types of alerts companies should build? So what I mean is, like, for me, I think it's going to be a mix of static alerts, ones where it's just purely a user does XYZ, boom, puts out a alert for you to review. But I think you also have to add in some sort of behavioral type alerts. So ones that can be a little more organic to users. So what I mean by that is, if you have a percent increase in spending of a user in a certain amount of days, could that be considered a red flag for your business? So instead of just having this, a user spends $20, it kicks out an alert. Okay, do a 20% increase over 1 hour. So if you're like online gambling kind of thing, could that be a sign of account takeover? Or credit card testing, things like that. So that's what I kind of mean by behavioral, or adding like velocity rules or something like that. I just think you need to be, you can get the low hanging fruit with, I think, static ones, because those are just the easy ones. But I think in order to kind of find some of those patterns, you really need to kind of make complex rules. You got any ideas on that, suggestions, or?
Yeah, so those conditional rules, a lot of those rules, which are like an if this, then this, or if this plus this, then this, you think about it like an equation. The more variables you can add together can sort of refine exactly what type of activity you're trying to track or you're trying to flag out. And it can also be really important for helping you to weed out the good people who might get caught up in your fraud
Oh,
monitoring that you
yeah.
don't impact, right? So yeah, absolutely, those conditional rules are super important. The other thing I would stress on is early warning signals, and that's where you're able to actually flag out that there is some weird activity happening.
Mhm.
And this kind of goes back to that abuse discussion, something that doesn't quite step over the line, but it's something that you want to tag to, whether you're tracking accounts or orders or IP addresses or anything that you're using as your like object of investigation, and you're able to tag it with that, saying like, okay, something weird happened here, not enough for me to actually take an action here, but then if that same thing pops up again, now two of those become super fishy, right? Two times that thing
Mhm.
is flagged. Now that's fishy. So it's really important that you have monitoring in place where you can track repeat activity that might generally, even if it's high velocity, kind of fall below your radar. You should be able to track it if you've got the right flags in place.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense, and I think you mentioned it early too. Not catching the good people up in this, because obviously you want those to get through as easily as possible. So, uh, you know, I think those complex rules help reduce a lot of the false positives too. I think in my experience, the most false positive I see are on those static rules, because they're not. You're basically making a rule for a whole population, um, that all act differently. you know. So.
Yeah. But, the hard thing about the static rules too, we're going to talk about operationalization in a moment, but as we think about what we're asking our team to do for us, if you're flagging something off of a static rule that is just a very generic sort of blanket rule, you actually make it even a little bit more difficult for your team to take a decision on what they're supposed to do. Perhaps you're automating that and you're just having the system take decisions for you. But if you're ever sending anything down to an investigator, you're actually making it to where they have to look at a lot more variables themselves because they weren't built into your rule to start with. So anywhere that you have the opportunity to take those complex rules, put a lot of the logic automated as much as you can to really hone down into what you want your investigations team to look at, is going to make your process that much more streamlined.
Yeah, that's a fantastic call out. Let's see. Let's move now on to case management systems. So I think what I want to, preface this on is, case management also includes kind of a tip hotline and web reporting. So a great statistic that I came up on is that 40% of frauds were actually detected by tips, which is nearly 3 times as many cases as the next most common method. So, to put that into perspective, nearly half of kind of all the work investigators do came from a human being saying, "Hey, something doesn't look right here," or "Hey, I know this person is going to do X, Y, Z. They're a fraudster," or something like that. And that's both for internal and external tips. So, it's 3 times as many cases as the next most common method, is just mind-boggling to me. And within that, so more than half of all those tips came from actually employees. So that's just crazy too, but it makes sense. They're in the weeds every day. But I will also preface that with, I think you have to have a good training and education fraud awareness program in order to teach them, what to be on the lookout for. But, hotlines have proven to reduce losses and speed up detection time and time again. And, what do you think about all that, Lacey? I mean, it was mind boggling to me, just realizing, I didn't realize that much came out of tips.
Yeah, I mean, and seeing and hearing that number is like huge. And I believe it. And I believe it because as you start to specialize the type of fraud that you're looking for and that you're investigating, naturally you're going to have things that don't quite fit nicely into one work stream or another. You're going to have investigators looking at things
Mm-hmm.
that as they start to realize, hey, this isn't quite my area of expertise, but there's something not right here. They're able to kick it over to a different team or and that's important, right? Having an organization set up for success to where even if somebody's seeing something, they're saying something. If it's not something they totally understand, but they know it's not right, those internal tips are super important. So yeah, I believe it. It's really, really good. But I think as far as external tips, that's where I'm going to focus a little bit here.
Mm-hmm.
It's been super critical for us in e-commerce because we're probably all of us have been victims of getting those like scam calls, robo dialers, those, you know, funky little text messages that come through that want you to click some really weird link, you know. But every time take the time to like report those, almost a lot of companies, especially e-commerce companies, have like a report suspicious activity page where you can go and actually provide a screenshot of what you're getting and give it to them so they can investigate it. But those are helpful inputs because those get routed, at least in the company I work for, we route those into a case management system where we have fraud prevention teams that track them and look into them, and they're you know, combining those with the information of customers who have provided it from other sources. And like we're looking at heat maps, geography based heat maps, telling us where maybe all these different company or these bad actors would be located. And so this is important for us because we're able to sort of detect when account takeover might be happening before it happens, the population, the specific geography and people they're trying to target with it. And a lot of times this is like vulnerable people, right? We're talking about
Yeah.
like, especially like if you're thinking about communities that are generally created around senior citizens.
Mhm.
You know, a lot of these populations that get targeted specifically, and we're able to then sort of figure out who they're going after, and we can put some additional alerts and monitoring around those customers specifically. But I think in case management, I'll shift gears here for just a second, Chris. We can come back to that topic if you want to talk more about
Yeah.
it. But in case management system, one thing you got to think about, you know, sometimes this is one of those tech implementations that companies sort of don't think about until after they're already like ready to go. It's like, okay, I got my fraud prevention system ready to go. Let's do this. And it's like, okay, but
Then
how am
everyone's
I
like, how do we do it though? Where do we go
gonna?
to actually do the work?
Exactly. You're missing that key piece of it, which is what's your workbench going to be? How are you routing the work to your team? Where are you going to track it? Where are you going to keep your notes? You know, so the case management system super important for that. It's really important to think about like, you know, who's going to use this? Is it just your team? Are you splitting the cost with another team in your org? Go back to
Yeah.
that build buy discussion. But you know, what controls are you going to put in place if this is something you can customize for your needs plus another team's needs? Do you want to be able to have all teams to see, you know, investigations that are happening across the
I was
board?
just going to say that you got to worry about, you know, the user access too, who should be able to see what you're working on. It's really confidential information, and you don't want to, you know, as we said earlier, you know, you don't want to give out the secret sauce on how things are being detected. So it definitely should be locked down to kind of a need to know, folks.
Of course. And then I think this is where case management systems get super interesting for like internal investigations specifically. And like, so Chris, this is going to like call back to our shared experience, but when you're doing internal investigations, you got to question like, do you want your human resources team to know about the investigations you're doing? Does that compromise your investigation in any way?
Mhm.
Do you want the finance team to know about it if there's any impact to your bottom line? Should they be knowing about this, you know, ongoing investigations for their financial reporting? A lot of questions that you'll have to ask for yourself and determine what case management system should do for you.
Yeah, no, all of those are amazing points. One thing you had talked about earlier, not to revert back to kind of the tips, um, I think a good case management system will have that direct connection to uh, some sort of tip type hotline. And with that, you should have three key elements to you know, a tip hotline kind of thing. You should have number one, a phone number where someone can call in, both internal and external. Number two, some online form they can fill out. So if they don't want to call, they can fill out an online form. Or number three, an email address, just a generic email address you can use that's locked down. But all three of those should have the ability to be anonymous. You know, a lot of people don't want to report fraud because they just don't want to be involved in it. So creating that anonymity is helpful to make people feel a little more easy on reporting something, especially if it's against someone they know. But I just wanted to digress on that one a little bit, just saying like that is really a key function of case management system, and it is really important. Um,
It is. On that
and
note,
then,
though, I also want to just expand really quick that It should also be flexible for the people filling out the information. Anybody taking the
Yes.
time to give you a tip, you don't want to necessarily make like 25 fields of questions and make everything
Yes.
mandatory, because then you're going to get abandonment issues. People are going to start filling out the top 5
Say
questions
this
and then
isn't worth it. This is just too hard. I don't want to deal with this. Yes. Yeah, I couldn't agree more on that one. And even with the anonymous piece, my last role, I built out or helped build out kind of that whole piece of it, including the forms people would fill out. And I left a space, where, if you want to be anonymous, are there any communication methods that you're willing to give? So if we have questions, we can still reach out. We don't need to know your name or any of that or anything, but if we're having trouble finding, the evidence that you're saying is there, if we could just email you and say, hey, can you share, a document you may have or something like that, that's key as well. But I think we both definitely agree that case management system is probably a really vital aspect to any successful fraud program. And I will state with the most nicest way possible that emails and Excel spreadsheets are not a case management system. It's a really good case management system will allow you to do metrics, be transparent, have that investigator dashboard so everyone can be as productive as possible. You know where things stand. But I think a lesser known fact of case management systems is that you can actually identify fraud patterns and trends with it. A lot of these ones that are built out have that already built into the system, or if you're going to do internally, it's pretty easy to pull a lot of that data right from all your cases, as long as you're collecting the right data sets that will tell you, oh, actually, you know what? We might have just uncovered a whole new fraud scheme that now let's go back to what we just talked about, which is continuous monitoring. Let's go do a deep dive into some of this data and see if there's other bad actors out there. So I think this one's one of the most vital pieces to a good fraud program, is truly a good case management system.
It is. Yep. And it helps you to take higher quality decisions too. Just the
Yeah,
fact that
that's a great point.
it's going to keep all of your information in one place. Even if somebody else did the work first and you're following up on a secondary case, like you're going to be able to see what work has been done there without. You can do a deep dive into all of the history of it, but maybe it's as simple as just seeing what the last decision was that was taken on it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a true case management system will definitely be scalable no matter how the business grows, where it goes. You're always still going to be connected to that tip hotline and those different methods that will never change. The way that cases come in will never change. You just have to kind of update the different parts of the business are going to make sure you're kind of going the right direction with them too. And I think we get back to that build versus buy that you started talking about again too, is you can go either way on this one. Again, there are definitely companies out there where you can purchase a case management system out of the box. A lot of them are fantastic. Some of them may be more a la carte for you. You could even do a hybrid model. Parts of it are externally built, parts are internally built. But either way, I think both would be quite successful. But if you're looking internally, obviously you got to think of, you're going to have internal resources, which include having some sort of tech function, as well as the people to implement it for you. Or if you're going outside, again, it's going to be kind of like what we first started on, which is tech implementation, where you're going to have those implementation fees and typical usage fees. But I can't really think of anything else that we might have missed here. Anything else to add, Lacey?
Well, I think we could talk about the case management systems all day long. You did have a point here, the productivity point, as you're talking about looking at handling time. If you live in live to work to live. But if you're in an environment
One
where
and the same.
yeah, if you're working toward, keeping your team like really efficient, and you need to actually put some productivity metrics in place for making sure that they're moving forward on time. In whatever type of investigation they're doing, you're not going to be able to track that off of, to Chris's point, an Excel spreadsheet. Like you're not going to be able to see how long it took them to do that investigation. You're only really going to be able to do that if you have a case management system.
Yeah, no, actually, you bring up a really good point too, because that will help with your kind of budget analysis and staffing analysis too.
Yes.
You're not saying you're watching your people because they're being too slow, but now you have a general idea of how long your case works. If you can, kind of do that forward thinking analysis, you'll be able to at least get an idea of what you can expect for cases coming down the road, how long they're going to take, and at your current staffing levels, can you accommodate that, or do you need to hire X full-time employees or a consultant to get you through that next push? But this is all the great things a case management system will do. But I'll get off my high horse on that one. But please don't track productivity off of the emails and consider emails a case management system. All right, so we finished strategic. Now let's go into the operational kind of areas, which I know is your favorite part, probably, Lacey, because this is a lot of your bread and butter. I think here, for me, there are, again, three kind of big buckets for the operational aspect. You have the people. Those are literally the key to everything. Are what going to make a fraud program. You can have all the technology you want, but if you don't have the right people to do it, it's not going to happen. Policies, procedures, terms and conditions, and then the ultimate to a fraud program, feedback loops. I think a lot of what we're going to end up talking about here, every section is going to have some discussion about a feedback loop. So I wanted to make sure that we talked about a feedback loop at the end, because it is so important to having an operational fraud department. So let's start with people.
Yeah. Wow. Well, so you've got a great list here, great grid. A couple of other teams you can consider when you're talking about an org chart for your fraud program would be like product and engineering. Some companies have an appetite for this, some don't. Totally fine if you don't. But if you're planning on building anything yourself, or you want to really have that sort of technical know-how for improving your models, helping your data science team, it's all about sort of enabling these other teams to work together more efficiently, then you might have a product and engineering group as a part of your organization. The other piece
I
is
would
the
have loved to have that.
I know, and it's not feasible for all companies, right? And we're all at different phases in our in the growth cycle of our companies. Some companies have it and some don't. And some people have it outsourced. So we won't, I won't go too far down that line, but you might actually be sharing a product or engineering team with another group in your organization, or you might be contracting it out. So that's a possibility as well.
Yeah.
And then, did you want to say anything about that one, Chris?
No, I was just saying, I mean, I think those are all perfect additions to, a well-rounded fraud program. But to your point, it all comes down to, where your company's at, can they afford that kind of thing? But
Yeah.
I digress. I'll let you go back.
The other piece I was going to mention, like about operational support, though. So even behind the scenes, you have people who are helping with scheduling, with adherence to scheduling, people who are helping with like your headcount needs, keeping your investigators working on time, monitoring or actually forecasting what your volumes are going to look like. There's a lot of this other piece of it too, like you can just consider as operational support, which you would want to make sure is a part of your program.
Yeah, no, those are great additions. And I think if I ever do this, kind of podcast again, I would add those to this, because I think they really are important, and you don't see a lot of fraud departments having that product, engineering and operational support reporting up to the fraud department, because that's where things get really hard, especially when you're trying to do like the tech kind of implementation or updating your alerts and stuff like that. You need the support of your product and engineering teams, but because they sit on different teams, their priorities may be something else, which makes it difficult when, okay, to be a good fraud department and catching all this stuff, you need to have this stuff updated. But the business wants obviously more money to come in, so they're going to put a little more emphasis on customer facing type enhancements rather than fraud program, which everyone kind of thinks is a money loser. But when you get down to the nitty gritty of the metrics, it's hard to show what fraud prevention you saved because you prevented it. You can get some ideas, but I think a lot of companies may forget to look at that aspect and realize that this investing in a good fraud program, you won't see significant results because they were able to stop the action before it happened. So again, sorry, I'll get off my high horse. My soapbox there. But for me, at least, I think. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Lacey.
You made a good point though, and you've been the head of a fraud department, thinking about those feedback loops, about how each one of these different teams needs to have some feedback loop to the others. If those teams aren't all within your purview as the head of fraud, then you can't hold them accountable to using the feedback loops.
Very true.
And that speaks to the prioritization point that you just made, which is that they might, if you've got an engineering team that is not reporting to you and they're focusing on building something else in a different space, but your investigators are giving feedback saying, hey, the UX design on this tool is like making me spend an extra 2 minutes per investigation, or whatever the number might be. And you, as the head of fraud, you're saying, like, I could be doing 1,000 more investigations per month if I could just have this one piece fixed. It's really important that as the head of that organization, you're able to hold that sort of influence over all of the teams that are impacting your space.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of in addition to the extra areas you mentioned, so how I envision it, and definitely chime in, Lacey, if you have extra thoughts or disagree anywhere. So you kind of had the head of your fraud department, whatever it may be. It could be a chief fraud officer, whatever. But under them, you have a few different pillars that really kind of organize the fraud group. One, I think, really important one is data science team, data engineering, whatever you decide you want to call it, but a group dedicated to nothing but playing with data and updating different fraud scenarios within your alerts and whatnot. And they're going to be a vital piece of a feedback loop, but they're also going to be the ones that will do kind of the continuous monitoring, the data analysis, finding fraud patterns in that mess and sea of all sorts of numbers and figures and data sets that can then be passed along to your investigators to investigate. And then once they investigate it, find where the fraud is. And then again, feedback loop will go back to data science, say, okay, well, now that we know that this is a known fraud pattern, let's start adding it to our alerts. So I think data science is a key one. One that I don't think a lot of people think about is kind of that legal support. If you can have some sort of legal department or personnel reporting up into fraud, I think it helps in kind of really two different areas. So the first area is really going to be helping you, number one, be ethical in your investigations and following all applicable laws. With large companies, they're all over the world. Every country, some in the U.S., every state has its own laws and regulations on how you can do things. So making sure that you're doing those all appropriately. But number two, having the ability to take the cases that you've worked and move them forward as far as, do you want to get restitution for the fraud actors? Do you want to work with law enforcement to bring criminal charges against the fraudsters? I always hear that, a lot of companies are really shy when it comes to potentially, referring criminal cases. They think, it doesn't look good, it's bad PR. But I think the majority of people actually think the opposite. I don't know what you think, Lacey, but to me, I would think, like, if I am a shareholder in a company and I see that You know, ABC Widgets has just uncovered a $400,000 fraud, and that person who did it is getting arrested. I'm going to think a few different things. I'm going to be thinking, okay, well, their fraud department works. They got it. And they're holding that person accountable. Now it's letting everyone else know that, okay, this company, they're not going to take any crap from anyone that, you know, I try and defraud them. I'm probably going to go to jail. And then, you know, again, as the shareholder, I'm thinking, okay, that's helping my profits as well. If they're catching fraud and they're putting the money back in the company, that is increasing my my stock price. Therefore, I'm continuing to make money. So I don't see it as a negative. I really don't. I actually see it as a positive. I think it's a deterrent first and foremost. If that gets out there, if it's, you know, out in the news and the papers, that it's a huge deterrent. And I think people respect it. I don't actually think a lot of people see it as a negative. What are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, so shaming is super powerful, right? There's tons of theories
I
that I'm
like
out
shaming. I love it.
shaming. The fact that like that if it, even beyond just like the actual penalties that would incur if you're caught here is also just the fact that you're out there, your name is out there. There's something to be said about that. But one key thing here is about the trust, and I do agree with you, Chris, because you're building trust with your stakeholders, you're building trust with potential customers, you're building trust with your employees. Employees want to stay at a company where they're going to be taken care of, and that part of that is knowing that company's going to be around for a while. It's important that you take action there, and then also just in general for your partners. Think about how many business partnerships you have out in the industry or with other companies, with suppliers. If, like in my case, it's an e-commerce company and you've got sellers on your platform, you're basically sending a message to anyone that your company interacts with that says, hey, we're doing something about this. We take it very seriously and we really value you as a partner. The reason why we do enforce so many things, we're taking this action against these bad actors, is because we want to be here for the long run and we're investing in our future.
No, I couldn't say it better myself. Okay, then so the last two investigators, I don't really need to go too much into that one. I think everyone knows a good fraud program is going to have fantastic investigators. That one's kind of a no-brainer, I would say. But the only, maybe additional point I would say with investigators is to, have a diverse background. You never know what you're going to come up with in the fraud space. So having people who have varying different backgrounds in the different types of fraud will only help you better learn, better be prepared, and better investigate. And I think within that, have a mix of experience levels too. Don't always go for the 25-year experience folks. Getting those fresh new people in gives you a fresh perspective. Number one, I mean that's the best way that you're going to continue to iterate in your fraud program is by having that fresh perspective. They're also on top of things in the industry that we may not be aware of because they are just coming into it. So I think that is a huge piece that you could really think of. And the last one is compliance. So to me, compliance would be the folks that are kind of sitting on top of the whole process, making sure that the fraud program is following the policies and procedures that they set out to follow, following our own rules, making sure that we're doing things, ethically, and also being part of that feedback loop, figuring out from different stakeholders where can things improve when they're, doing their kind of audits, where are the different sections having pain points that maybe we all didn't realize we had that we could fix. And then continuing that feedback loop. So those are kind of the main ones that I think of. What are some of the benefits of it? You're going to get experts in your field. It's going to enable that feedback loop for all these ones. And because you're having all these different groups kind of working together, it's going to increase productivity, but it's also going to reduce the points of failure. Because if for some reason, data science didn't catch something, the investigators should, when they kind of do just ad hoc reviews, or compliance should catch something when they do, their audit. So there's always some backup there, so you're not missing too much. Obviously, costs associated with this, in my mind, are your salaries and your ongoing training and education. But I want to throw this to you, Lacey. In hiring all these people, what makes a good fraud fighter? What
Yeah.
do you look for when you hire?
I want to add this. I'm going to add this as another point to your associated costs to think about, because it's not as easy as just doing an interview, bringing somebody in. You may actually want some people to do a practical assessment to understand their ability. And we're not talking about their ability to find fraud necessarily, but you want to track things like critical thinking, or pattern mapping or pattern detection. Those are things that you may want people coming into your team to be able to do. And so there could be some, again, these could be third-party assessments that you pay for, but that's some costs that you would want to think about too. So back to your question, Chris, about what makes a good fraud fighter. I want to be really clear about one thing, is that it's not just your investigators that are your fraud fighters. It's your an entire group of people needs to be forward thinking about what we're doing to prevent fraud. And because they are working together in one ecosystem here, even your data science people, those who are looking at the numbers or providing numbers, they're not just querying, pulling reports and sending them over. I mean, they could be doing that day in and day out, but also in case there's something they see. I can tell you countless times that our analysts in our organization have given feedback on some things that just didn't quite look right. I mean, these are the people who are building your dashboards sometimes. They're doing the data visualization for you. And as they're building it, they might be thinking to themselves, like, I built this dashboard and I tested it and I'm looking at the data, and why is this spike happening? Like, this is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And then they're going to pass that over. And maybe that's something you didn't even have a monitor on. You didn't even have a goal based off of that. And this person is now able to sort of spot it out for you. So building that muscle in your organization, that fraud fighting is like the ability to always be thinking on your toes, but most importantly, to question everything. If it looks, Chris, we've said this so many times, was see something, say something all the time.
Yes.
It doesn't matter what your role is. Me, as the head of my department, if I have, one of our supports that's actually collecting evidence for enforcement and legal action, if that person comes to me and says, hey, I know it's not my job, but I noticed this weird thing and I was thinking maybe we should check it, I'm gonna be like, absolutely right. Yes, let's check this. I don't care what your job title is, what level you are. I don't care if today is day one for you. If you see something that needs to be checked, let's do it. And so that's something you can't really teach. That's the type of fighting spirit, I guess you could say, that you want in people when you hire them from the start. What do you think, Chris? What's your ideal fraud fighter? Do you have anything to add?
No, I think, it's definitely, I think you either have it or you don't. I think it's people who have that curious mindset. The need to understand, I think, are the ones who make fantastic fraud fighters, risk folks, because they want to solve the problem, but they also want to figure out the why and the how, and that's goes right back to the feedback loop. When they're able to figure out the why and the how, they're able to start thinking of ideas that will elevate the program going forward, because now they're starting to think of ways that, okay, how can we stop this in the future? We don't want folks who just want to put a Band-Aid on things. We want folks who really are looking to plug a gap and plug it for good. So I think I agree with every sentiment you said. I think, it really does go outside of just investigators. I think everyone in the group needs to be a good fraud fighter. Everyone in the organization needs to be a good fraud fighter. It goes way back to what we talked about earlier with tips. A good fraud fighter is going to provide tips, and that's 42% of the tips that come in end up being fraud. So,
Exactly.
that's it. Everyone is a fraud fighter. Everyone is responsible for risk and compliance and fraud within a company, both internally and externally, all the way from the CEO to the person who just started 2 minutes ago.
Yeah. But the best part about building an organization like this is the fungibility of your resources. So, like, as you want to see where you can build these career pipelines between your teams, because you may have somebody who's coming in as your frontline day one, very fresh investigator, and this person could really have the chops to be a data science analyst at some point, or maybe
Yes.
they've got an interest in compliance, and your ability to sort of help them develop and mature into what their actual desire is. First of all, you're retaining good talent in your team, but also then you're just building a really lean fraud fighting machine, your entire organization, because you're going to be sustainably staffed with people who are going to stay with you for the long run, who are going to actually move. If you have one team that needs a little more help than the other, you're able to actually move those resources around so that you yourself are not impacted by things like higher volumes or spikes or capacity issues. And then on top of that, this goes to your point here about ongoing training and education. But as you're continuously developing and monitoring the career trajectories of the people on your team, you're providing them these training opportunities. They're not going to go looking elsewhere for that. They're not going to be looking at other companies with openings that are promising certifications that they'll pay for and whatnot if you're giving it there already. And some of this is about feedback. As leaders, we also have to remember that we need feedback from our team to make sure that we are supplying them with what they need to continue to do their jobs effectively.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. That's a fantastic point. You need to invest in your people. You need to find out, not, I don't want to say what their strengths are, because yes, you need to figure out what their passions are. Some people may have a strength in data science, but they actually have a passion for law. So maybe start cross training, get them so they can follow the career path that they want to and still help your whole program. So understanding, I think your people is really, really important. Understanding them at a personal level, I think, is really important too. Just understanding where they're coming from, what they want to do, how they want their career to be. Maybe fraud isn't what they want to do, and that's okay. I think a lot of people tend to shy away from that or feel, no, they just don't want to be here, kind of thing, and get frustrated with it. Mentor them. Mentor them. You as a leader should absolutely be invested in the success of your people, no matter where they want to be. If they aren't a right fit for that role, it's great that they've identified they don't want to do that. Help them find what can work best for them. So that way, they'll be happy. You can then, hire in somebody who wants to do more of this stuff, but don't just pass them off. Invest in them, mentor them, be a good human being.
Yeah, well, because Chris, what happens when so if people they find out that the work you're doing or that they're doing within your org is not what they want to do, and if they do eventually leave, which does happen, obviously, then they've been promoted to customer, right? Or they've been promoted
Yeah.
to a top
Yep.
referrer. They're the people who are going to be spreading the word about whether your organization is a good one to work for, and they're going to be,
So
by
true.
mouth getting more people to work for you or become your customers or become your partners. So yeah, it's always important to, invest even if you know that person is potentially going to leave at some point.
Absolutely. So motto there is invest in your people, be a good leader. Hire the right people. All right. So we're moving on from people to policies, procedures, terms and conditions. Lacey, this you can run circles probably around anyone in the space. So I kind of want to let you take the reins on this one if you don't mind, and tell us about everything. Everything. How did we do things right?
Whoo, okay. So I'll just get ready here. So
Deep
here's
breath, right?
policy was my passion. As we talk about people who had a passion for things, policy and just policy in general was my passion for a large part of my career. With program optimization, letting them know where there was leakage in their program, where people were abusing their travel policies. Maybe that one guy in accounting who always somehow sneaks on the business class flight. I had the opportunity to be in those types of scenarios and see it. And so I had grown sort of bitter over a couple of years early in my career as I was seeing these people who were just constantly abusing their policies. And so I had a pretty hard stance on it, I would say, to put it very lightly. Coming into my current organization, as I was like, no, there's a policy. It's for a reason. We wrote it. Shoot, we went to legal and got their approval for it, which took 3 months. Like, let's use this policy, right? It took us so long to get it approved. But I'm here to say, I am reformed. I am a person who now can preach the fact that there is a place for policy, and I'm never going to tell you to go and, let's not pull out the burn barrel. We're not burning our policies. That's not what I'm saying to do. I'm saying that in this changing world where there's so many different types of fraud, because things are expanding. We can sit here and talk about NFTs and crypto and a ton of other things that are happening that we need to continue to be really cognizant of the changes in the environment. But the truth is that there's so many things being created day over day over day that we just cannot keep up, especially if you're trying to build a lot of structure around your fraud program. You're going to be so stuck on building structure, you're never going to be able to innovate. And part of structure is policy. It's building those standard operating procedures, telling you exactly how you're going to govern something, how you're going to investigate something, all the way down to the what rules are going to trigger, what exact monitoring processes are we going to put in place. And then you're so busy building the procedure around it that you forget to actually do the work. So I'm here to tell you today, build your policies, keep it flexible. Your policy should be a guiding principle. If you've ever taken part in a tenant creation exercise as you're creating core tenets or guiding principles for your organization, those are the things that you lean up against in a time of crisis. When everything's on fire and you don't know which direction to move in, you should be able to look back at your policy as your guiding light on what you do with your program. However, it's not necessarily the thing that is telling you what to do every minute of your day. And that's what I would caution people on, because what you really need out of the fraud fighters on your team is you need them to not be procedure monkeys. Like, you don't need them to just following black and white words, process map with arrows telling them what to do next. You want them to have high judgment. You want them to have those critical thinking skills. I'm going to say it again, the see something, say something, because if it's not right and they need to speak up or take a different action, it's like, you don't want that person coming to you with your big manual saying, well, here on line 328, it says I'm supposed to do this. You want to say, is that the right thing to do? Another thing, we didn't talk about it in the section, the gut, right? All of us as fraud fighters, we've got that gut that tells us something feels off about the situation. And that's the curiosity thing you spoke about, Chris, which is like, pull on that, use that. We have that conscience. And some of these weird behaviors are telling me otherwise. And most importantly, then, as an organization or a program, you need to be able to put something in place that even if you don't have that person take action right then, have some ability to enable your people to put a pin in it to come back to it. And we talked about this with those early warning signals, a way to continuously monitor and track the situations that don't feel right. Because as you have more and more of those pop up and it's the same one over and over again, that becomes a pattern. And then guess what? For all you people out there who have been like basically turned off this podcast because you love policy so much, I was one of you. I promise I was there. I'm coming back to make peace with you. I'm extending the olive branch, which is that once you have so many of these weird anomalies that your team has been taking an opposite action on, guess what? Now you can write it into your policy. You can say, okay, this has happened so many times that we do need to put a caveat or an extra clause in here that says, okay, when this happens, now this. Or create a new policy exactly around what your company expects and wants people to do in order to work with your company better. So that's where policy does. That's closing the loop as we talk about the feedback loop. It's closing the loop on what your policy should read like, but just make it flexible. If people can explain to you exactly why they've been circumventing the policy or why they needed to go into a different direction, then as a leader, you can sort of understand there may be a little bit of logic there and be open to that feedback and to changing your policy when the time comes. So that's a piece. There's some things that we can't fight back on, right? And we talk about compliance and ethics. There's tons of policies in there that we didn't make up for ourselves. We're beholden to them. GDPR, all these other things that are out there, regulations, you cannot, those are non-negotiables, right? Those are policies we all have to stick with. So don't point back to this podcast and say Lacey Ramsey told me I don't have to follow these policies. I'm talking specifically about your own policies with your own company and what you're doing inside that company. I'll pause there. Anything you want to add, Chris?
No, I think there are definitely a couple things that kind of resonated with me. The last one you said, compliance and ethics. There are definitely some policies you don't want to interpret. You don't want to kind of go out on your own, because they're really there for a reason. Like we don't want you to kind of guess on ethics. We want you to be ethical. You shouldn't say, well, this one doesn't apply today. So I'm glad you kind of said that. There are some things where they're going to be black and white. You got to do them because you got to do them. Doesn't matter. But one thing that resonated was when you were talking about letting people kind of do the right thing, even if it may not quite follow a policy. And I think that kind of goes back to the old adage of, when we're dealing with law, is like the spirit of the law, not the letter of the law. So the law was there to do a certain thing. Yes, there may be black and white in certain aspects, but there's that spirit of the law that really is what you want to get into, being a human being, doing the right thing, and knowing, when you do have to kind of veer off course a little bit. But I think in general, policies and procedures internally, they're going to at least create that basic foundation where everyone's going to be on the same page. And from there, just like you said, you can start iterating from there. When you have better learnings, when there are things that you can start doing black and white, you can start doing that, and it's going to make for a better whole. And I loved when he started talking about, doing, the training and being good fraud fighters and internal policies on that. Fraud awareness training, that's one that I think should definitely be in every organization. The more you have fraud training, the likelihood of detection increases by 45%, and tip submission increases by 58% when you have ongoing training. So things like that, keep in mind too. It's not all just about, when you do this, do that, kind of thing like that. It's also a commitment to your stakeholders and your internal groups on, we are the fraud program. We're here to help you as well. How can we help you? These are some of the steps we're going to take to make sure that, you feel welcomed, that you feel okay to come to us. One thing I kind of wanted to talk about too a little bit is that external element of policies, procedures, which I kind of lumped in as terms and conditions. So what do you feel about having kind of black and white terms and conditions? For me, the fraud fighter in me says, I want it black and white because I want to be able to hold someone accountable for the actions that they have done within fraud. But then again, as you talked about, there's going to be times that you kind of have to make a judgment call. So, as a policy guru and maybe slightly obsessed with policy, what are your thoughts on kind of those black and white terms and conditions?
Yeah, this is the one where I have to calm my inner, passion down just a little bit, because having worked in dispute resolution with a chargeback space, terms and conditions are the things that will save you and protect you when it comes to any sort of chargebacks that you receive, especially if it's based off of service reason codes or things that basically outline the way that you're going to do business with your customers. It's really important that those T's are outlined. And more importantly, you have to follow kind of down to the letter exactly what, when you're doing business in those cases, like with financial services companies or payment processors, generally they're going to have some pretty defined policies, and you as a partner to that process, you can't define what their policies are. They're telling you what to do. And of course, if you want to win your chargeback disputes, like you have to follow those processes. So as a result, TNCs are super important. I do think that that's a place where you don't want to be as flexible. You know, you don't want to leave it open to interpretation by other people, right? External
Yeah.
parties. The open to interpretation is truly about what your internal policies are and with your team and the procedures you want them to follow. Because you get a say in who you hire, right? You get a say in who those people are going to be. You don't get to say who your customers are going to be or who your bad actors. Oh, I want these fraudsters, not these fraudsters. You're going to get whoever picks you. So you want to make sure those TNCs are set up in such a way that they're going to protect your company.
That makes complete sense. You know, other than obviously having your internal folks, whether it be legal compliance or even, you know, your fraud people writing these policy procedures and such, other than kind of just the salary you have to pay them, can you think of any other costs? There may be none, but I'm trying to think of any other costs you might have to kind of think about for, you know, implementing policies and procedures. I can't think of any, but you might know better than me.
Well, so you mentioned salary. Another piece of that is a little bit around consulting. So sometimes as you create
Oh, good
policy,
point.
you may want to get a third party view of it just to poke at anything that might not be protecting you the way that you want it to. And probably the other one is just determining on, again, this goes back to what, if, especially if it's like an internal policy, how you really want to disseminate that out to your group. If it's something that you may
Yeah.
have just materials costs that come with creating a policy, especially if it's something you want to use as a desk manual.
No, that's actually, yeah, I didn't really think about that stuff. The consulting point is an interesting one as well too. The last company I was at and a few others, I have also hired out, you know, a third party to basically write it for them. They kind of give their idea of what they want, and they have them write it for them, and then they do the different iterations. And it may be a really cost-effective way to do it if you think about it too, just purely because, you know, you're now spending time on innovative thinking rather than kind of writing down these policies and procedures. Just having, you know, your people work on, I don't want to say more important things, but things that really need their attention as an expert. So interesting you brought that up. Good call.
There are tech costs too. So even like on TNCs, there could be tech costs associated with where you place
Yep.
those on your website. And you know, is this something that you want to actually make people read through and acknowledge? Do they have to
Mm-hmm.
scroll all the way to the bottom before they click the box? Does it have to be moved to a different place on your page before somebody can place an order? There could be some tech debt associated with how you want to display policies out to your customers, as well as internally. If you're rolling out policies to your team members, do you want to create trainings around it? Do you want to pay for, you know, professionally curated trainings, facilitators? So it kind of depends on what you want to do with the policy once it's created as well.
Yeah. So you know, we've definitely talked about like how all our discussion is really just on how to build out kind of a fraud program that fits any type of, you know, industry, but specific to your industry, e-commerce, do you have any, you know, tips for terms and conditions? Because you had mentioned talking about, okay, well, do we want them to be required to acknowledge them? So because you deal so heavily in the chargeback space too, any, you know, couple tips you can give people watching to maybe help with chargebacks or things like that in the e-commerce space?
Absolutely. A big one being that, especially in e-commerce, you definitely want those TNCs right next to the checkout button. It has to be in a place, you know, it can't be hidden on the page at the bottom in fine print. It needs to be right
Mm.
there so that people can, you know, they can't say that they didn't know that there were terms and conditions. Another one to think about is language of preference. So as you've got your customers who speak different
Oh,
languages, if you're a global company, you want to ensure that your policies are available in every language. As a result, you may have some translation costs that come with your TNCs. So ensuring that your customers have access to your policies in their own language would make it easier as far as like their banking, especially if you expect like, and what I mean by banking is like whatever card, if you're allowing people to use cards on your platform, wherever their card is from and whatever that acquiring bank is. Um, if like you are based in the US and you're allowing payments from a card or a bank that's based in Mexico. So if you know that the language of preference would be Spanish, for example, you want to make sure that your policies are available in that language as well. so that as you're doing business with that bank, if you're going back and forth with the payment processor trying to dispute challenge a dispute that's been given to your company, then you can also display that, look, we've offered this policy in both English and Spanish, and then additional information about the customer profile. So if their profile is indicated that they prefer to receive communications in Spanish, then you can prove that you have offered that. So that's just a couple of things that I
Love
can
it.
suggest anybody in the chargeback space.
I'm sure they'll take that one to heart. Those will help. All right, so let's move on to feedback loops. I think the most important thing of everything. You know, for me, when I say a feedback loop, I'm thinking of ways that it is going to continuously improve not only the fraud program, but whatever product you're dealing with too. It's going to involve communication with stakeholders. It's going to involve dealing with findings from the different stakeholders on where are fraud risks, where are gaps, and then once identified, disseminating that information to the other groups within that feedback loop to figure out, okay, well, how can we make it better? And then going and making that better. So then the next time some bad actor comes through, and we can see, okay, well, did this prevent it? Are we still dealing with kind of reviewing this manually, or is now there new a fraud scheme? And then, continuing that iteration and then feeding back into your technology and your internal systems, continuing to make those better. But I can't harp enough on how much I believe a feedback loop is, the key to really having a program that is going to be viable in the future. I think it just makes better products. And this will increase your fraud prevention and detection. And there's really no cost with communicating effectively. I mean, of course, there's going to be costs with, fixing the product and technology, but all a feedback loop starts with is literally just communication with your stakeholders, and there is no associated cost with that. So, I think the next slide that we'll show, which is kind of a visual, helps really play into that. But I know you're an extremely effective communicator, Lacey. So I'm sure you've got a few things to say on feedback loops. So let's have them.
Yeah, well, I think with a team, you said it, it's about that communication aspect. It's about having a group that feels comfortable to tell each other when they're noticing something that might be broken, or maybe it could work better. The true trait of a really highly matured organization is when they can spot things that can be done better, even when they're already working just fine. Because you don't want to settle for just that minimum bar. Like, yep, it's working. You want to have people who are continuously spotting out opportunities where, yeah, it's working, but it could be better. And this is all about like creating this ownership mentality among your entire team. It's about taking pride in the work that you're doing, and not just in your space. Like if I'm an investigator, it's not just in my investigations process, but it's also maybe it's the quality of data I'm receiving. If you see a report or an alert that's coming to you and you think truly this could be made better, maybe there's a variable we could include that would make this a little bit more quality alert. You're going back to your data science team, you're giving that feedback. They're maybe testing it and then they're going to throw it to you again, and you're going to look at it and give them even more feedback. You want to foster this improvement mindset across your group. And then if your team has the resource and budget to do it, at some point you may even decide that you actually want like a continuous improvement team. I wouldn't necessarily say this is something you need as you're starting out a fraud program. It's something that could be built and added, and maybe it comes organically from the players on your team already, but you have people who are constantly there and their sole job is to just inspect your processes and give feedback to everyone. Similar to internal audit, but maybe with a little less a negative connotation that comes with an internal audit. It's more of like just a group who's there working alongside every other team and is sort of helping them to identify waste. Maybe there's some inefficiencies in the processes or a way that we can work better. So, and I like something you said earlier, Chris. It was about you want people on your team who are always asking, they're naturally curious. It's the how and the why, asking those questions. Same thing here. You want the why behind what's broken, not just what's broken and how to fix it, but why was it broken in the first place? How can we avoid this situation in the future? How can we build something stronger? That's, that right there is just the output of a really good feedback loop.
Yeah, and I kind of think of a feedback loop almost kind of like Kaizen too. If you can come in as an individual every day and just even fix 1% or increase productivity or something by 1% a day. So that could be something as simple as I usually manually send out this email. I'm going to automate it instead. If you do that every day, you alone have increased 365% by the end of the year. So, even minutely small things can make a huge difference in the end, and continue making a better product, better program, and hopefully, catching more fraud. So, that's why I think feedback loops are super important. But I think the best way to kind of explain everything we, kind of have talked about is to really show a visual of it. I think this graph really shows that circular motion, the feedback loop, how everything works together. So quickly going over it. So you have the bad action, whatever it may be. It goes through your fraud prevention technology that you've implemented, or built in-house and now are monetizing it by selling it to someone else. So it's gone through that. Hopefully that catches the majority of things, but things may slip through and then go to your kind of suspicious activity alerts, which is your fraud detection. Those are going to be those ones that are really honed to your business model. Okay, now you've got those alerts. They get kicked to that awesome case management system that we talked about so much that you need to have. From there, things are delegated to the investigators. And from there, the investigators do what they do best, investigate. And they're going to produce those findings. They're going to produce the, who, what, where, when, how, and why. So the main point there is, okay, how do we fix this from happening again? So the findings go to data scientists. The data scientists say, okay, we see what happened here. Let's go do a deep dive, see where the other places may have issues that we can do. They then identify trends and gaps and say, okay, looks like we found some more issues. Let's feed those potential issues into the fraud technology prevention and detection system again. Boom, we've just made that smarter. So those findings then also go to your legal support team. So your legal support team will do two different things. One, if you're trying to go for restitution or criminal prosecution, they will kind of take that case and move it forward from there. But internally, for the feedback loop, they're going to help start updating policies and procedures, terms and conditions if they figured out, okay, something along the way didn't work the way it should. But they'll also help update terms and conditions on the external part, say, okay, well, this fraud happened because, we actually in our terms and conditions allow it. And by now putting it in there, we can start building items around that type of gap and feed it into our prevention and detection methods to then, boom, there we go. We made that one smarter again. And then the third piece there you have is internal stakeholders. So that could be engineering, product, whoever it may be, to figure out, okay, what about the product failed that allowed this to happen? They can then do product enhancements and, hey, wham, bam, thank you. We got the next fraud prevention and detection implementation being super smart. And then kind of up top there, I have compliance, where they're watching everything. They're, just like you said, they're trying to do audits, identify where things could be done better, making sure that people are doing the right things the right way, and then continuing that improvement there, which all in turn will make this whole loop work better. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. Is there anything you wanted to add to that or disagree with? But that's kind of how I envision a feedback loop and how all the pieces we just talked about really kind of come together to make your basic fraud program successful.
No, Chris, I have to give you kudos. This is a really great process map, a really great flow, a great way to envision what the feedback loop looks like. There are certainly intricacies, and I'm sure people watching, every program is going to be different. You're going to have little bitty pieces that might differ, but in general, this is what you're aiming for. So great job. I have nothing to add.
Perfect. All right. So, with that, we just finished operational discussion. So now we have both kind of basic foundational elements there of a program. So what does that mean now that we put them all together? Success. Hopefully all this information really leads to a successful fraud program build out, kind of from the ground up. And hopefully everyone enjoyed this discussion. But I'm hoping, Lacey, that you can kind of finish us off and maybe give us some trends that you've been noticing within the e-commerce space specifically. As this seems to be the biggest space that we see a lot of this kind of fraud in. So you, the expert on e-commerce fraud, take it over.
Sure. So I'll just tell you a little bit, and I'm going to date this. These trends are recent as of the last 6 months, I would say. So starting at the beginning of the holiday shopping season for 2022. But our e-commerce transaction volumes are continuing to increase year over year. And in general, across the past few years, it's been between 10 to 15%. And so some of what we've been seeing, and I'm just outlining like the top 5 here, triangulation. So this one keeps popping up in various locations across the world, globally. What this means, things like buyer-seller collusion. These are where you've got your customers and you've got your sellers, especially if you have an e-commerce platform with a marketplace. This is a situation where we've got maybe people are not kind of representing themselves as they are, and so they could be trying to sellers masking themselves as consumers so that they can buy things and bump up their ratings. Maybe they're not necessarily stealing dollars from your company, but they are certainly doing something so that they can improve their sales. And that just isn't on the up and up. So buyer-seller collusion is a big one there. Another one is also we've got seller misrepresentation. Again, this is about e-commerce and marketplaces, but there's been a lot of this like sort of dormant account situation where you might have a whole bunch of accounts of new customers on your platform, but they're using payment methods that might have been farmed off of things like the dark web, where you've got sellers who could be putting a lot of money out for these stolen forms of payment. And then they open up a lot of accounts so that they can just throw these new cards on there. If you ever see a lot of card testing, and a lot of times you're going to hear this, you may not catch it yourself as an organization, you might hear about it from a bank. For example, if they see there's a lot of bin testing, that's usually an indicator that there's something going on with a lot of payment methods that have been farmed from somewhere. And again, this goes back. We all know what skimmers are, but like people who are using skimmers too and selling all these account information, this is a big one. So the triangulation between people who are representing themselves as a seller and then the people who are representing themselves as consumers. The second one is shipment layering. This is that fun one where you see that something's been purchased and oh, it's coming to my place, and oh no, it's been intercepted. It's going somewhere else. I don't know where it's going. You look up the address. It's an old Blockbuster from 1994. I don't know why this location was selected. Like these are really fun, and I laugh about it because this has happened to me personally. But it's like when you see that also like people who might be trying to sell products online and they sell them, like perhaps they bought it from one retailer and they're trying to sell it from another for a profit. Maybe not explicitly written out in your T&Cs, for example. But you want to think about that because you've got people who are doing shipment layering. They could be forwarding shipments to one location. They could be recalling the shipment. They could be having it intercepted, meaning that somebody is actually physically showing up and taking the package before a person can pick it up. There's a lot that goes on in this space, and we're seeing a ton of it. This is where getting signatures, like if you have the ability and budget, of course, to require signatures on your shipments, will help you greatly. Even better if you have any sort of like photo rendering, like the ability to take a picture or use FedEx or UPS or any delivery service provider who provides you a photo of that shipment being delivered, that will protect you as well. The third one, attacks on tools and resources. And what I mean by this is that there's actually a big issue that happened around the major, Cyber Monday shopping around last year, which was that these fraudsters, and these are very creative fraudsters, didn't actually attack the retailers themselves, but attacked the tools that they thought that the retail fraud teams would be using.
Oh,
And these are
interesting.
Yeah, so they wanted to take down some of these, like your know your customer tools, the things that help us to verify like personally
Huh.
identifiable information about our customers so that we know, is this person actually making this purchase or is it somebody else? And they actually tried to take down those companies and their tools, which would, of course, thwart our ability to prevent fraud. So, you always want to have a good, if nothing else, you want to have a really good communication channel with all of your third party vendors and service providers so that you know if they're being attacked, they're letting you know first thing. One second, I'm going to grab a drink of water.
No worries. Everybody needs water. I'll have some water too.
Allergies, man. Yeah, allergy season. Gotta love it. Okay, so moving on. Another fun one, these manipulating social media. Okay, we love our TikTok, we love our videos, we love the people, but sometimes these influencers, they want to reach out to their group and they mean well, but they will post a gift card or some other payment method, and they're like, "Okay, friends, go crazy, use this," and what happens is that there's a frenzy.
Oh yeah.
Everybody, they pass it along, they send it over to their friend, who sends it to their brother, who sends it to their baby mama, everybody is then getting this payment method and trying to use it. And this is, if nothing else, I'm not saying that necessarily that payment method is being used inappropriately. I mean, it is, but we'll get into that. That's a topic for a different day. But what is happening is that this is now officially like chum in the water. And these
Yeah.
fraudsters, who are the sharks, are like, wow, look at this big commotion that's happening. This is my time to attack because this company is now worried about all of this social media frenzy going on, and their systems may not be able to handle a very, craftily created attack at the same time. So you want to be extra vigilant there, especially if you're using any fraud monitoring that requires like systematic or automated approaches. We are allowing your system to take decisions for you, and you don't necessarily send everything to an investigator to take a decision on, because as we all know with machine learning, dirty in, dirty out. So if you're getting a lot of decisions the system is taking because it's based off of this one super weird thing that's happening, um, you may not be taking the most high quality decisions possible at the time. And then that fraudster is going to take advantage of the fact that your systems are down. So
Absolutely.
beware of that. And then finally, victim assisted fraud. This is when you've got your vulnerable people who don't quite know. Maybe they're getting those scam text messages or phone calls. They're being confused. They're being preyed upon by these fraudsters who are trying to get their personal information. And it's not, we know people like this who think that it's just about putting your password out there and don't let people have your password. We know that it's more than that now. You can't even let people know anything about you personally or otherwise.
Yeah.
We see a lot of
Scary.
that fraud. It's so scary and it's so sad. But we see a lot of that happening now too, where people, they may on the surface, and this is where your fraud detection programs and monitoring systems are so important, but they may not even be able to detect because it truly is this person. It truly is your customer making a purchase, but they're maybe doing it against their will. So you really want to get, this is where being able to have a team dive into the anecdotes from your customers and also taking tips. Because if you get those external tips, it may be from a loved one or a person who's close to the situation reporting it, saying, hey, this person was actually taken advantage of, and collecting all of those tips. And then you as a company and the head of a fraud program, you're able to sort of decide what you can or should put in place in order to help those customers.
I Some of that stuff is just mind blowing to me. Like, you just don't realize how many schemes are out there until you start talking about it. It's crazy, and it's really averaging around 10 to 15% increase year over year.
Yeah, for the transaction volumes, yeah, for growth. But of course,
Wow.
with fraud just kind of takes up with it, right? So
Oh
it's,
yeah, exactly. They're hand in hands. That's
yep.
that's incredible. I mean, I think what fraud globally is like a was a $1.9 trillion enterprise, something like that. I know it's trillion with a T. I can't remember what the exact number is, but it's no wonder that fraud is some people's full-time job because there's a lot of money to be made in fraud, and
It
we're always a step behind, it seems.
Well, because with these fraudsters, and many of us lose track of this, of thinking of it this way, but someday they wake up and this is their job, like you said, Chris. This is
Yeah.
they're not eating unless they are defrauding someone, if they're making money off of some scam. For us, like we're getting paid to come in and stop them. But it's like if we don't stop this fraud, we'll stop the next one, and we're still doing our jobs. Their job is that fraud,
Yeah.
and they have that hunger for it, you know. But this is where I gotta say, and let me just add on to this, these trends, these are things I've seen from my perspective. You can also just, as you're on LinkedIn or you're networking with people in the industry, you can hear about trends just in general. You don't necessarily have to subscribe to newsletters or pay to know about this information. It's out there for free. But if you are ever confused or finding yourself in a position where you need some help, especially some, professional support and consulting on your fraud program, I can't recommend Chris enough because he's been in
Thank you.
so long. Yeah, he's your guy. So, Chris, I don't know. I'm sure you did plug earlier your consulting company, but again, if anybody forgot, reach out to this guy.
Thank you for the plug. I appreciate it. Well, with that, I think we have come to the conclusion of the presentation. Lacey, I cannot thank you enough. This was awesome. I actually learned a lot more than I thought I would today, but there's no surprise. Every time we talk, I always learn something new from you. But again, thank you for taking so much time. And, hopefully you get some people reaching out to you on LinkedIn or whatnot, and you make some new connections and whatnot. So if anyone has questions as well, Lacey, she knows everything. So with that said, Lacey, again, thank you so much for joining today, and hopefully you'll join on another podcast that we can create on a different topic.
For sure. Thanks for having me, Chris. It's been fun.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for joining. Don't forget, keep a lookout for other topics on the Fraud Fighting series. Have a good one.